All right, guys, Dr. Shawn Baker here. Let's talk a little about salt today. Now, salt, it's delicious. It makes your meat taste better in many cases. In the right context, it can be really good for you, but some people say salt is bad for you, and we should minimize it at all costs. Now, what is the truth today? We're going to talk about some of the biggest misconceptions and lies about salt and set the record straight. Now, be sure to stick around at the end, and I'll give you what I think the overall totality of the evidence seems to show. But let's define what salt is. Now, salt is an element or a compound composed of sodium and chloride. That's a typical table salt we're concerned. There are other types of salt. There are magnesium chloride and so on and so forth. You know, any two cations and anions put together are often salts. And so it's a wide thing. Well, let's stick to sodium chloride for here. So both sodium and chloride are essential minerals required for our body to function. They assist with the electrical currents that keep your heart beating, your lungs breathing, and your muscles contracting. Salt is often extracted from lakes, caves, mines, in the ocean. All animals require some amount of salt. In nature, many animals will climb across mountains and across vast terrains just to get at salt, to different salt licks. Now, these typically often are herbivorous animals, and there's some interesting context on that. Fortunately for us, salt these days is relatively easy to come by. Unfortunately, some of the fearmongers out there have been reported that salt is dangerous for us and we should avoid it at all costs and keep it to the minimum. I think there is some balance in that. Let's talk with some of the most common claims out there. Now, number one, salt will cause hypertension or high blood pressure. Now, that really just doesn't hold up. A 2016 meta-analysis showed that there is literally no conclusive evidence that can pin down salt as the major culprit for hypertension. That said, sodium retention has been associated with heart disease. And what causes sodium retention? Well, metabolic damage. What causes metabolic damage? Well, a hyper-processed food. And guess what? A lot of those hyper-processed foods happen to have with them. They often have salt in them. It causes unweighted fat gain. It causes, this metabolic damage, this insulin resistance, and then ultimately that leads to hypertension. In a 2014 study, the American Journal of Hypertension found that it wasn't salt that caused hypertension, but rather, more often than not, an unhealthy BMI. Now, participants in the study who were overweight or obese had a systolic blood pressure that was 10 to 20 points per milligrams per mercury higher than their healthy weight counterparts. This 2003 meta-analysis reinforced this idea, showing how a reduction in weight, irrespective of salt intake, coincides with a reduction in blood pressure. So it's not the salt's fault that someone is retaining weight or retaining sodium, in fact. It's the fault of the metabolic damage caused by the other foods in the diet, the grains, the sugars, the oils that mess with the metabolism, and that leads to inappropriate sodium retention. Now, number two, some people out there are saying that salt causes insulin resistance. Again, this is also not grounded in reality. This has been talked about by many folks in the vegan community. They're obviously they're anti-fat, anti-meat, in many cases anti-salt. The lack of appropriate salt and sodium levels is one of the drivers of insulin resistance. So it's not low, it's just inappropriate amounts. And so when the body requires sodium, without it, the body becomes fairly stressed out. The body gets stressed, it releases stress hormones like adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. These stress hormones cause the body to retain more water and become temporarily insulin resistant. When the body is stressed, it doesn't care about digesting your food or processing insulin. This means that any insulin that is wandering around when your stress hormones are released is harder to deal with. To your cells, having unprocessed insulin remaining in your blood is like basically having a construction job outside your window. For the first week, you hear the construction work all the time, but over time the sound becomes background noise. You don't jump as readily when you hear the beep beep of the dump truck or the jackhammer banging along, because you're used to hearing it. Similar in your body. When your body intermittently sees insulin, it responds very quickly and lets insulin go put glucose in the cells. But if insulin is always present, then we kind of get desensitized to it, and that process or unresponsiveness to insulin is known as insulin resistance, which many of you guys are familiar with. And in some cases, it can start from not having enough sodium in the diet. In fact, there was a study in 2016, a meta-analysis, that showed that restricting salt actually worsened insulin and C-peptide scores. 2011 study looked at 152 individuals with no existing health problems and put them on a salt-restricted diet. Within 7 days of a low-salt diet, their insulin resistance got worse. So you can avoid this scenario altogether by consuming enough salt. It can lower your stress. It allows your body to better respond and process insulin. Now, lie number three, eating salt makes you fat. Now, eating salt on its own does not cause you to gain any body fat. Now, like I said, we might have some fluid shifts. However, the body does sometimes hang on to sodium for various reasons. Again, we talk about metabolic issues. Sodium is vital to keep all your body processes running. It sustains the energy currents in your body. It helps you to maintain healthy blood pressure and supports muscle contractions. If you don't have enough salt, your cells won't work properly, and eventually you will ultimately die. All this said, your body can and does hang on to sodium. Consuming more salt might cause an increase in weight by a pound or two, but that's not fat. That's sodium plus water. And when the body has a healthy metabolism, it's either to utilize the sodium stores in its tissues for later, or it excretes it out through the kidneys in a normal fashion. However, eat salt with a lot of processed food, a lot of processed carbohydrates, you might see a greater bump in weight. Remember, it's maybe more along the lines of the salty foods. It's thought that carbohydrates will pull in extra water with that. Some people quote 4 grams of water for every 1 gram of carbohydrate. This coupled with sodium will cause a retention in fluids for sure, and you will feel like you're swollen and inflamed. However, if you have a healthy metabolism, you'll likely just utilize the carbohydrates and the sodium properly. Now, if you eat salt, carbohydrates, and have insulin resistance, you probably see a bump in your weight. Now, this is because your body can't process the carbohydrates into energy as easily as it could or should. So instead, it stores some of the calories as fat, and there will be some fat gain associated, but it's not, again, from the salt. You can avoid unwanted fat gain by eating foods that trigger your natural satiety, like meat, low-carb vegetables, along with your salt. Now, number 4, everyone requires the exact same amount of salt. We all need a certain 2,000 milligrams a day. That is also not true. Now, salt requirements increase or decrease depending upon your lifestyle, the health, and the dietary practices you have. People who need more in salt include people who are very active, that sweat a lot. People on low-carb diets often will need that, particularly in the transition phase. Pregnant women, because they just need more overall fluid volume. People with something called POTS syndrome, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And any person is, running on a high stress level. Often they'll require a little bit more salt in the diet. Now, the last claim here that pink or sea salt or Celtic salt or whatever special type salt, lava salt is better than the other. There's no real evidence to support that. Obviously, avoiding contamination is important. Basically, salt is salt. I mean, some will have different trace minerals, but the actual sodium chloride itself is pretty much consistent across the board. Okay, so final thoughts on this. Really, I think, one, I should say that there are some people on a carnivore diet that do extremely well with very little salt. Now, meat has salt in it, it has sodium, it also has potassium. Some people will talk about how much potassium relative to salt is really what the critical threshold is. One of the other thing is salt consumption is often a proxy for hyper or ultra processed food. So if you're eating a lot of salt in your diet, the odds are most of it is coming from not the salt you put on the meat, but the potato chips and the pretzels and the popcorns and the cookies and the breads and the cakes and all the ultra processed food, the bars that are out there. So I think we shouldn't overly restrict sodium. Can you consume too much? Can you overdo it? Sure, that's possible. And how do you know if that's going on? Well, you'll start to have some swelling a lot of times. That could be one of the symptoms of that. Anyway, guys, thank you for tuning in. If you like this information, don't forget to hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, share this with people. Leave comments about what are your thoughts on what questions you'd like to have answered. All right, guys, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.